nejprve se musím omluvit za dvě věci. Za první je, že budu asi mluvit hlavně anglicky. To je kvůli tomu, hlavně kvůli tomu, že jsem přečetl Habermasa v angličtině a nechtěl bych překroutit jeho myšlenky s tím špatným překladem do češtiny. Druhá věc je, že došlo k změně názvu svého příspěvku od abstraktu. Jak vidíte, teď jsem se jmenoval Justification Registers and Intersubjective Communication in an Online Public Sphere. Jde mi stále o roli literárních kritiků ve veřejném prostoru. A taky mi jde o to, jaké změny vyplývají z toho, že my nyní jednáme v online světě, kde ty rozdíly mezi odbornými kritiky a laickými příspěvky nejsou tak dobře poznat jako v masmediálním prostoru. Takže jde mi to o koncipování takovéto změny. Ale a můj příspěvek bude spočívat v dvou částích. První část bude teoretická a druhá část bude analytická na základě jednoho případu. První teoretická část to mě inspiruje nejen Habermasové tvorbě, ale taky jsem si vypůjčil pár pojmů z dvou francouzských sociologů. Jsou Dominique Cardon a Luc Boltanský. A asi poznáte, že pojem Justification Registers je pojem Luca Boltanského. Oni rozvíjí některé myšlenky Habermasovy v určitém směru a jak za chvíli dokážu. Ale a potom budu uvést jeden případ z online diskuse v českém internetu. Jde o diskusi o české živelné hře od divadla Y, který se jmenuje Já. Je to hra o životě Stevea Jonesa, který měl svou slovenskou premiéru právě včera. A vzal jsem to záměrně jako menšinová žánr, jako menšinová hra, kde bych asi našel jenom malé množství diskusních příspěvků online a kde bych mohl mít tím pádem určitost, že můžu v malém času, který měl k dispozici, že jsem mohl analyzovat v podstatě všechny příspěvky, které existují v online prostoru k této hře, abych měl jistotu, že nedošlo k sampling errors ve svém přístupu. No dobře. Tak teď asi budu přecházet k angličtině, když půjdu o první teoretická část svého příspěvku. Habermas was concerned with identifying the contextual constraints that make an ideal speech act possible, and thus opening a way for language to function as a search for genuine understanding or consensus among subjects acting in a life world, orientated towards common problems and bearers of background knowledge because of the fact that they belong to the same language community. One of the lines of argument that he went on to develop, in particular in the book The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, which came out in 1985, it's a series of lectures where he opens a dialogue with different philosophers, different modern philosophers. One of the lines of argument that he took, particularly when he was discussing postmodernists like Jacques Derrida, was that certain genres of writing, such as philosophy and literary or artistic criticism, have a specific role in mediating between expert cultures and everyday practice. And that bridging role for him was vital to the renovation of value orientations and need interpretations within the public sphere. And the role that these genres played was to effectively meld together discourses, specialist discourses and non-specialist discourses, without erasing the important functional differences between those types of speech. So one of the things that a genre like literary criticism does is to mobilize the rhetoric characteristics of literary writing, of literature itself in other words, but to subordinate it to a certain discipline, a discipline that's characterized by a distinct form of argumentation. And it's the existence of these mediating genres and the capacity to hold together this tension between specialist and non-specialist discursive universes that's been vital to the quality of debate in the public sphere, and it's been vital to preserving the autonomy of fields like science and art, by allowing them to develop their own specialist discourses and have someone else, if you like, do the mediating job of communicating with a wider public. So what role do the professional critics play, if you like, the pundits that we were talking about in last night's discussion? I'm dealing with similar figures to those, really. In mediating between a field like science or a field like art, Habermas argued that philosophy and criticism effectively mediate modern subjectivity because they make aesthetic evaluation possible. And they apply critical reason being the supreme judge of modernity. So they perform a sort of a partial integration of different discursive universes. And the situation is slightly different if we're talking about writing about journalism that's writing about science and journalists that are perhaps writing about art. If we're writing about when journalists are writing about science, science reporting functions to a certain extent because the science reporter can suspend some of the usually applicable validity tests for journalism on the assumption that the validity tests that have been applied prior to that by the scientists in their own work are also valid in the journalistic domain, or can also be taken on trust. So in other words, a science reporter wouldn't necessarily have to get two independent sources to verify that a scientist was speaking the truth, because they would assume a certain amount of truth could be read into what the scientist had said by virtue of the trust on the scientist had followed proper scientific methods, and that those proper scientific methods carry a certain validity in a wider public sphere as well as purely in the scientific universe. That's not quite the same in art. In art, Habermas was saying that the figure of the critic becomes more prominent in establishing credibility and in establishing a certain validity test for what they're saying. So, in the world of art, the epitome of critical judgment is the figure of the literary or art critic themselves. They appear to be the essential mediator of taste, something called taste, and taste, and Habermas goes back to Nietzsche here, in arguing that taste is the ultimate consecration criterion, or validity test for knowledge of the social world in a large part of modern aesthetics. Literary criticism was therefore seen by Habermas as a discourse specialised for questions of taste, which had been institutionalised since about the 18th century, and which was contributing fundamentally to the autonomisation of the artistic life world. So, the question that I pose myself on the basis of that is, what then happens when communication is, if you like, more thinly mediated in an online public sphere, when some of the argumentative discipline that would be applied in a mass media environment by the figure of a literary critic dissolves among a greater variety of participants, is distributed among people whose expertise as critics isn't as clearly labelled as it would be in a mass media environment. Does criticism in the blogosphere still mediate as effectively between expert cultures and the everyday world as it does in a mass-mediated environment, according to Habermas? Or does the convergence of these genres undermine the literary critical power of judgment? Because in a blogosphere, it's much more problematic to assume the same degree of normative convergence between the expert culture and the non-expert culture that Habermas argued was vital to the role that criticism plays in aesthetic modernity. So perhaps we move from a risk in that world, which we usually think of in terms of the risk of oversimplification, vulgarization by the popularizer, the critic playing the role of popularizer to a wider audience. Perhaps we move more to a risk of miscommunication and the complete loss of illocutionary force, to use one of the terms that Habermas borrows from linguistics theory. Perhaps that's the more the type of risk that we have when we're looking at discourses in the blogosphere. Now I've tried to explore some of these problems by applying an analytical technique which I borrowed from Dominique Caudon. And Dominique Caudon uses a grid to assess the rhetorical power of the justification registers that different participants in public discourse are applying when they speak in the public space. If you like, he's looking for what it is in public discourse that supply the institutional conditions of felicity for the critical discourse to actually work, to function. And I'll show you now the diagram that I've adapted from Caudon. I apologise at the beginning that the top isn't very visible, the labels at the top aren't very visible. So I'll tell you what they say in a moment. First of all, if you could looking at the horizontal axis, this deals with the relationship of the speakers of different publics. And it combines, in Caudon's words, a musical with a linguistic metaphor to distinguish between speech acts of two different kinds, or two different polarities. So on the left, the polarity that Caudon calls polyphonic or illocutionary. The idea of polyphony comes from music. The idea of illocutionary force comes from linguistics, of course. And he's distinguishing there speech acts that, in his words, compose or refuse to compose with the voice of others. So on the left, the polyphony is a speech act which is placing what the speaker says in an orchestrated space of views, or a space of orchestrated views, because it's deliberately, if you like, making reference to what other people say as well. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's a monodic mode. Monody in musical terms is a type of melody where one line of melody is dominant. So the speaker is only interested in the sound of their own voice, essentially. They're not speaking, they're not addressing any particular public, they're not making reference to other speakers. Now to give that a linguistic metaphor, you could distinguish between the idea of illocution and the idea of perlocution. The idea of illocution makes intercomprehension the fundamental goal of communication, whereas the idea of perlocution makes exercising a force on other people with your arguments the goal of communication. And that's often linked to status of the speaker, the force that they apply is often linked to the status that they can claim in a particular public forum. So on that horizontal axis, it's fairly clear that if you like, the Habermasian ideal speech situation pulls us towards the left on both counts, on both the musical metaphor and the linguistic metaphor. If you're looking at the vertical axis, that distinguishes between distant and intimate, I should say, at the top. Relations to knowledge. It's not so much a relation to public, it's relation to what the speaker is saying, to the object of their speech, rather than to the the addressees of their speech that are in play here. And at the top, we have speakers who are interested in having a conversation with a strong level of personal engagement. And at the bottom, we have a more impersonalized mode of speech, which makes reference to publicly available categories. So it's two modes, if you like, two modes of bearing witness to events. One is direct, based on personal experience, based on first-hand knowledge, based on socialized knowledge. And the other is indirect, mediated by something else, second-hand knowledge, generic categories. So at the top we find personal interest and engagement. At the bottom is disinterested knowledge, abstract knowledge. And Dominic Caldon used this, it's probably best if I explain this axis with reference to his example. He was using it to analyse the discourse that went on in radio phone-in programmes. And he showed that the primary source of knowledge in the latter type were mediated images furnished by the press and the mass media themselves. So what I mean, down at the bottom, when people are involved in that type of speech, the publicly available categories they're using tend to come from the press. They tend to be referring, in his example at least, they were referring back to subjects that had been discussed in news programs on the same radio station. And so we can refer to this axis as well to understand Habermas's insistence on the vital mediating role played by genres like literary criticism. But it's more equivocal where Habermas himself actually stands in terms of a normative discourse. Whether his normative discourse, in terms of trying to identify the conditions for the ideal speech situation, should pull us towards the top or the bottom, really depends on how criticism is organised in a given public sphere. Because he's not saying that either experiential knowledge or this abstract disinterested knowledge are privileged in terms of the types of argumentation one would want to find in an ideal speech situation. Both could be applied, but it would depend a lot on how the public sphere was organised. So you might perhaps speculate that, if you like, the pure Habermasian project of an authentic life world would pull us directly towards the left of my diagram, using both experiential knowledge and abstract, disinterested knowledge in order to obtain illocutionary force, in order to resonate within a polyphonic narrative. But perhaps, and again here I'll have to explain in a moment what the top bubble should say, if I haven't cut it off when I've translated my diagram to PowerPoint. But at the bottom, you might suggest that in a colonised life world, a life world dominated by mass media environments, we would be pulled down towards forms of expert speech, which were validated by inserting themselves within a repertoire of publicly available categories. Whereas at the top, we should say speech act valued in a disintermediated life world. I'm suggesting that perhaps in a disintermediated life world, the type of life world which you might get in the blogosphere, you tend to find that forms of speech, the Habermasian project almost would pull us towards more authentic, more authentic, not the right word, more experiential types of knowledge, more personal types of knowledge, as the types of justification register that would be most valid in that situation. Okay, so enough theory. I'll move on to my example now. And as I said, I'm looking. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Shouldn't take much longer than that. What I've done is I've looked in the blogosphere for traces of discourse about the Czech play ER, and I've tried to. I'll go over that slide. And I've tried to position them on this grid. The first slide shows some quotations from a discussion that took place on the website iDivadlo, and it concerns It's a series of comments people have attached to ratings that they've given to the play. And the ones I've coded white, are comments by editors of the journal, of the online journal. The ones I've coded pink or red are from members of the public. And I'm not going to, I'll leave you for yourselves to judge whether there are important differences between the two types of contributions. What I'm just going to do is it's almost a methodological explanation here, and explain to you how I've used the coding categories by giving you an example on each slide of a couple of quotations that I've coded in a particular area and explain why I've done that. So, for example, one of the critics talks about konečný jiný pohled na věci. And they're saying, in other words, they're contrasting the play with an orthodoxy in order to position it with relation to other plays that might be dealing with the same type of topic. Or, for example, another critic says here, Cincinnati vyžadují zřetelný pokus o výpověď sostesení. And looking for the one I've never mind. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong. I'm got confused. I'm looking at the wrong piece of my presentation. What I wanted to pull out on this slide was the way that some of the critics in particular are using using labels like insenatste. When the critic says coś se cení, the discourse is relatively assured about what counts, what types of value counts, and then another talks about výpověď. They're talking about testimony. They're assuming that the author wants to communicate, wants to tell a story. So they're using labels to position it in relation to publicly available categories at the bottom of the diagram there. This is a slide which shows a series of reviews and blogs of the program of the play, and the codes, the colours here. The white are reviews that appeared in the press, then republished online, online editions of the press. The pink are from blogs, so members of the public who blogged about the play themselves, and the sort of, I'm not sure what colour it is, yellow-green colour, is from an online discussion forum. The only trace I found just in a free online discussion forum where someone was saying, go to this play, it's good, I recommend it. What I wanted to just illustrate here is a couple of the reasons why I put some of the comments on the left-hand side of the diagram here, in the space of orchestrated views. And again, here we have someone saying, konečný nabízí radikální jiný pohled na fenomén jménem Apple. That was a critic saying that, and so they're positioning the play within other plays which they have presumably seen and deal with a similar subject matter, and they're saying this one is different, is better for some reason. You have another critic saying here, this play míří inscenace je naprosto srozumitelný i pro masové PC uživatele či počítačové lajky a zdá se míří především na ně. So he's identifying what kind of audience the play is aimed at. And then finally, there's a blogger, interestingly, who says, podle vyjádření tvůrců je inscenace kolektivním dílem, jak je to Y se in the theatre company zvykem, ponechávám stranou, či do diskuse, zdá dobrým. In other words, they're inciting co-discussants to apply judgments, good or bad. So again, in that case, it's the blogger who is referring to other people, other, in this case, imaginary contributors to the discussion, who might have a discussion with him about whether a particular way of a particular form of theatre is a good or a bad type of theatre. Just 2 more slides, and then I'll come to my conclusion. Here we have a discussion thread. I've shown the order of in which the discussion thread worked as well, labelled by the numbers and the arrows on the diagram. And it's a discussion thread which appeared below one of the reviews on the previous slide. And here, interestingly enough, the debate seems to move across quite radically across the grid. And the colours here refer to different participants, because two of the participants in this thread have speak up twice. And it started by someone who was writing in Slovak actually, and then the other contributions are in Czech. But what's interesting is how the second and the third contributors attack the first contributor quite with use of sort of an irony, almost cynicism really. And with a strong sense of personal engagement at the top of the diagram. They're employing an ironic conversational tone when they say líbí se mi to, ale hodnotím jen z pohledu běžného smrtelníka. Nejsem takový divadelný odborník jako pan Žitný. And the other one says, já taky souhlasím, pan Žitný je zřejmě teatrovod, jen by mi zájem na tomu přišlo divadelné zlé. So it's fairly typical for the type of modality you get in an online discussion, of course. But what I find interesting about it is not so much that they're being cynical about the first contributor, it's the fact that their own justification for their own views applies to their own use of their own personal experience. The fact that they liked it is the only justification they're giving us for why it's good. And that apparently is the most important validity criteria that they think is valid in this type of discussion space, and they may be right. It may be that the realm of personal opinion is what counts in that type of discussion. Finally, just out of interest, really. I found an interview with Branko Horicek. He's the author and the director of the play. He comes from Košice, interestingly. And he's a young director, and he was asked essentially to justify in his own words what was interesting, what was relevant about the play that he'd just written. And most of his comments seem to veer towards the right-hand side of the diagram. In other words, they were monodic. They were exercising what I call in my first slide the distinction of the solo play, and that's probably fairly typical of how an author talks about their own work. In other words, he was tending to connect the meaning of the play to his own personal and professional development, to tell a story about the story that he'd just written. He uses phrases like this: "Jsem se osamostatnil, etc." Toho jsem přesvědčil, Toho being the director of the theatre company. Toho jsem přesvědčil, že je to dobrý nápad. Udělat hru o Steveovi Jobse. Jsme Schmidovi studenti. He was talking about the identity of the theatre company as being people who've studied under a certain professor in Prague at VŠOMU. And díky té okay, I'll move on to my conclusion now, because my conclusion is fairly simple. I don't make any great claims about the accuracy of my analyses. I'm using the grid here basically as a thinking tool, a simple visualization tool that helps me make sense of how different participants in a public discussion are positioning themselves and their conversation partners in order to validate and to challenge claims, in order to criticize I think what the very tentative and provisional analysis suggests to me is that some of the justification registers that are typically employed by the bloggers and discussants about a cultural product may well be closer to the justification register employed by the cultural producer themselves. In other words, tending to veer towards the right, towards the top of the grid, than they are towards the discourse of professional critics. Because professional critics tended to be more towards the bottom and left of the grid. And that would be in keeping with the disintermediation thesis of online communication, and with the idea that tellability becomes the main validity criteria, as in literature itself, possibly at the expense of mutual understanding, the project of the Habermasian ideal speech situation. But it would also suggest then the role of the professional critic is not surpassed, that they still have a distinct role to play, so they're not being supplanted by bloggers. On the contrary, we need to find a new way to institutionalize literary and artistic criticism that permits it to play this distinct role, the illocutionary force that Habermas imputed to it, against the risk of being bypassed by, if you like, a flood of monodic speech acts that don't usually add up to anything resembling a public sphere in the Habermasian sense of the term. And maybe there's an echo here of the Hegelian need for philosophy at the dawn of the modern age, which was conceived as a response to the decline of religion as the unifying force, and as the necessity of generating new forms of normativity from modernity itself. Perhaps we need to find new ways of generating normativity from post-modernity, if you want to call it that. But anyhow, that's almost a passing thought. My main claim is more methodological, really, and it's that visualization tools like Cardon's grid here, I think, are very useful devices for comparing different modalities of speech acts, relating to the same subject, relating to a particular product like a theatre play, say, where you can isolate a particular body of discourse that concerns it. And perhaps, therefore, they're useful tools for operationalizing a normative theory of public discourse, such as Habermas is. Thank you.
Takže krátky prostor na otázky na Simona. Já bych se možná zeptal Simona, on hovořil o tom, že ta kritika v podstatě, že úlohou té kritiky je mediovat jakoby ten text, ten estetiku jakoby toho divadla, toho uměleckého prostoru, že jak se to projevuje jakoby v tom metodologicky, když si měl ten příklad, prvé se to tím, že například ti kritici více teda zasazují tu hru do kontextu jakoby jiných her, nějakého toho žánru, zatímco jakoby ta veřejná sféra spíš jakoby hodnotí tu hru samostatně a nezasazuje do toho kontextu, nebo čím se projevuje jakoby ta mediace toho textu, té kritiky.
Podle Habermasovi ta mediaci vkusu jde o, to je to nejpodstatnější úloha veřejných literárních kritiků. A jde o to, že někdo se musí v moderní estetiky jakoby zosobnit ten vkus. A literární kritiky anebo filozofové se vypracují k tomu stavu, tím, že získávají určitou odbornost. Je to podobné jako ti veřejní intelektuálové, o kterých jsme mluvili včera, že čím se vynikají. To je velmi, i včera jsme těžko hledali vlastně klíč k porozumění tomu, co to je. A někdo zmínil ten pojem pundit v angloamerickém prostředí a nikdo asi neví, čím se vynikají ty punditové. A stejně jako asi v čem se vynikají literární kritikové, čem jejich vkus je směrodatný pro ostatní členy veřejného prostoru, je velmi těžko říct. Je to občas se podobá samotné literatuře, čili jak jsem říkal v úvodu, literární kritika se vypůjčuje techniky z literatury, ale přidává k tomu určitý způsob argumentace, který má být osobitný pro literární kritiku. A pak asi tvá otázka směrovala k tomu, vlastně, jak se změní v online prostředí, že? Protože ten vkus, který se projevuje třeba bloger, já mám za to, že bloger se nemůže domnívat, že má tu pověst jako literární kritik, který je formálně placen, je veřejný znám, je to jeho povolání, zatímco pro bloger je to jeho radost prostě psát třeba o divadelní hře. Nemůže se domnívat, že lidé budou brát jeho slova vážně, jen protože nemá jméno, nemá renomé. Takže ten vkus blogera musí spočívat v něčem jiném. A proto jsem se navrhoval, že spíš se směřuje k té osobní stránce věci, k té horní část mého diagramu. A musí se zdůvodňovat jeho názory na základě osobní zkušenosti, spíš než na základě nějaké pozicionování v rámci nějakého orchestrovaného prostoru názoru.
Ještě Miro, krátka poznámka.
K tomu možno to bolo vysvetlené, ale zaujímavé, teraz si aj povedal, že vlastne ako bloger vlastne nemá reputáciu nejakú, ako má v klasických médiách. Otázkou je, že blogy robia aj ľudia, ktorí majú nejakú reputáciu a robia to ako paralelný typ šírenia informácií. Teraz, že či ty, keď si robil túto analýzu, si aj analyzoval, že či sú to naozaj známi ľudia, alebo tam bolo spomínané nejaké meno Žitný. A teraz vlastne, že to je asi teatrológ, že či naozaj je teatrológ a či bol problém iba, že tí ostatní ho nevedeli rozpoznať ako toho, ktorý má reputáciu. Lebo v takej diskusii sa môže aj objaviť odvolávanie na blog človeka, ktorý je uznaný všeobecne a iba to, že použil inú formu šírenia svojho názoru alebo ovplyvňovania verejnosti.
Áno, máš pravdu, že kdyby to studio dělal důslednější, tak bych musel ověřit. Protože blog, který dělá novinář, je podle mého názoru je to spíš podobně k komentář, než k blogu člena veřejnosti. Ale já jsem jenom této explorativní studie jsem se vyjádřil z toho, jak byly označovány v tom veřejném prostoru či blogy. A v tomto prostředí, pokud vzpomínám, tak ty blogy byly vždy označovány jako blogy, jako by byly od členů veřejnosti. Čili každý mohl založit tam blog a nebyli. Byl to prostor, kde taky psali redaktory. Bylo to na stránce i divadla online časopisů. Takže bylo to barevně oddělené. Tyto příspěvky jsou od novinářů a tyto příspěvky jsou od veřejnosti. Tak samozřejmě, kdyby tam napsal třeba novinář z jiných médií, asi by nikdo z redaktorů by hned asi nepoznal, ale předpokládám, že asi, že ti reagující na ten blog neznali a používali to označování teatrolog ironicky, bez toho, že by skutečně poznali, že je to teatrolog.
Děkuji za za odpověď a my si teda na chvíľu odpočineme od literárního tématu, ale tím se vrátíme k prvé příspěvku na Vlaska, ale nyní bych dal slovo Zuzaně Nevesové, která bude mít příspěvek o evropské identitě, jak chápe Jürgen Habermas.